Good afternoon. This is Lisa Cukier from Burns & Levinson. I'm here with the Business of Family webinar series. This is our third episode, and I am delighted to be joined by Arden O'Connor, who is not only a professional acquaintance and associate of mine, but also a friend and somebody who I have worked with extensively and socialized with. And she's generously agreed to be with us today for a program that I think is very important to many people, especially in this time of the COVID pandemic. Right now, we're dealing with a lot of COVID-related challenges that are creating anxieties, and it's actually impacting families and family businesses, family wealth, in ways that we weren't even expecting. I think initially we thought that this would be a pause in March and we would come back to it by summer. And then in the summer, we thought, okay, we're gonna have a couple months off and out of our offices, but surely we're gonna be back by Labor Day. And then Labor Day came and went, the holidays came and passed, and here we are in 2021, looking at vaccines, wondering when we are prioritized for ours, and recognizing that we have been in a holding pattern. We have been advising our clients and assisting our family office clients through a lot of difficult issues. And now we're recognizing that this is longer term than we ever expected. And even after we have our vaccines, we are looking at taking precautions and dealing with shifts in family structure and business structure, both internal and external, for a very long time. This has been a significant game changer. And as people realize, that's when we develop some mental health concerns. So without further delay, I would like to introduce my guest, and then I'll come back to talk about my practice. But I want to first introduce Arden O'Connor, who founded the O'Connor Professional Group to address the needs of families, mostly families of wealth, family offices, and individuals through some challenging issues, behavioral health issues in particular, including mental health issues, special needs, addiction, mental health challenges, developmental challenges, eating disorders, learning disabilities, and recovery challenges. So without further delay, Arden, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lisa, for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to present with you, and I've enjoyed thoroughly the times we get to collaborate on cases. So I started O'Connor Professional Group almost 10 years ago now because of a family story. My youngest brother, Chris, who grew up in the greater Boston area, we did a brief stint in Arizona, and then he came back for high school. He struggled with substance use from the time he was 12 years old, and his issues got worse and worse the older he got. And he went through probably a 10-year trajectory, bouncing in and out of psychiatrist, therapist offices, inpatient centers, detoxes. And I kept saying to my parents at the time that this was really hitting a crescendo, I was in Harvard Business School studying healthcare. And I said, you know, I've never seen an issue in the healthcare space that costs more to families emotionally, financially, logistically. And, you know, our family spent about $500,000 out of pocket on his care and didn't feel like even with that spending, we knew what we were doing or we had a plan that was a long-term one. And so I became interested in how do we have a better outcome for families like mine. Unfortunately, my brother passed away 2 years ago from an overdose. And I really am on a mission to make sure that with behavioral health issues, substance use, mental health, eating disorders, and autism, no other family has to go through what we did.
Arden, again, I am so sorry about Chris's death. I remember when that happened and it was just awful. So we're all thinking of you and sending your family prayers and thoughts.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. So I'm Lisa Cukier. I practice at Burns & Levinson. I practice law, and my practice is very much focused on families and helping families get through crisis. That may be crisis in the way of divorce, or even some happy events like marriage and how to protect wealth through marriage in the way of prenuptial planning, postnuptial planning. Sometimes families have some sibling rivalries or internal strife. And so I represent families and individuals within families to get them through difficult family issues that relate to undue influence claims or potentially claims of lack of mental capacity to make decisions. I assist families with their strategic planning for estate planning and for planning for individual members who may be dealing with some compromising issues, as well as blended families and people meeting new romantic interests later in life, and all the challenges that come up when there's multiple family expectations about wealth, about love, about obligation, and it's all about relationship. I am a lawyer, but I'm a former social worker. So I try to bring that navigating systems kind of approach to the work. But I note that the Kaiser Family Foundation found that 45% of adults said that the COVID pandemic was harming their mental health. So Arden, tell us, what are you seeing among your clients related to COVID these days?
Sure. So I think it's interesting because COVID, as you mentioned, I think everybody initially thought it was going to be a pause. We certainly did as a company. And even though we're operating in person, how often, how frequently we see people has changed over time. And certainly in March, when the world went down into lockdown, many of our families did. And so what we saw for a period of time is everybody sort of standing still. And even with issues of substance use or mental health, people were saying, I'm not sending my loved one to a hospital. I don't want somebody coming into our home to coach someone. Now, given the length of this trajectory, I think people are finding that they can't wait that long to address some of the issues that exist with loved ones. I would say more globally, what we're seeing, though, is a worried well population that may never have hit our radar screen. So people who are highly functional in their jobs and in their personal lives, but who are really struggling with anxiety and depression, somewhat from COVID for sure. The anxiety of, am I going to be exposed, especially as we're seeing up here in the Northeast, the rates rising. If people are experiencing more and more loved ones that they know that are getting impacted by the pandemic. But also if we think about the political landscape, I mean, there's been so many reasons that for folks who normally had pretty stable lives and pretty structured routines, that's all been thrown up into the ether. So we've got parents who are now managing kids doing remote learning. We're seeing people who, on the one hand, I think celebrated the lack of a commute into an office and from an office home, but are now realizing that the expectation, especially with the economic uncertainties of being on all the time, is exhausting. And the traditional outlets we had to go travel, to go enjoy theater, to be around loved ones in person, those have been primarily taken away. So much higher rates of anxiety, much higher rates of substance use, both with people who had a pre-existing issue, but I think also with a demographic of folks who've used it as a coping mechanism, and much higher rates of depression, which frankly, all these three things were already on the rise before the pandemic. It's just exacerbated over time.
How is the system dealing with the difference between the mental health issues and the physical health issues? Do you see prioritization in one direction and not the other? Is it equal? What are you seeing?
It's a great question. So I think, I think the mental health, if we think specifically about inpatient facilities, there's certainly a shortage of beds for emergency type situations, a psychiatric short-term unit where someone would go. I have to say that many of the residential programs that we work with, and those are primarily those that accept private pay clients or clients on commercial plans, they've adapted remarkably well to figuring out how to accommodate guests in their facilities or residents in their facilities and also maintain appropriate social distance and PPE and how do you test and all those kinds of nuances. I would say in general, however, there are still families who are very reserved and nervous about somebody contracting the illness. So like a parent of somebody with an eating disorder might have a certain level of reluctance unless the situation has gotten particularly acute. And the last thing I'll say, and I've been saying this a lot, with people who are well established. So if you are somebody with bipolar disorder, as an example, and you have a medication regime and an established team and a routine, this time you may have converted to teletherapy or telehealth, and that may be okay. If you are a newly sober person or someone with a recent diagnosis and no context, and you're not going to go into a residential facility, those are the folks that we have particular concerns about, because while I think it's wonderful to see the transformation of the telehealth psychiatry and therapy industry, for some people, remote intensive groups is just not enough support. And I think there are a demographic of folks who are struggling, isolated in their homes and really not doing well.
Along those lines, in terms of that in-person contact, there used to be group therapies and that sort of thing, or partial hospitalizations and different centers where people would show up for a period of time. Is that still happening at all, or has that been shut down?
That's mostly remote. I'm sure there are some examples where there are in-person opportunities across the whole country. We're a national company, so I'm sure there are some that I'm not aware of, but I can speak specifically to the Northeast, which is we have clients constantly saying we need a behavioral health partial program, which for those who don't know what that means, it's basically a program that's not residential, that runs from 9 o'clock to 2 o'clock. There are groups, there are individual sessions. You meet with a therapist, a psychiatrist, you might meet with a case manager or a coach. Those types of programs have all moved online. And for some clients who are highly motivated, it's a seamless transition. But for many, and I'm sure you see those, Lisa, we certainly do, for clients whose parents or whose spouses are saying they really need help and the person themselves is on the fence as to how serious the issue is, it's a much harder recipe to still be in your home, picking up a computer and participating. And we know with some of the self-help groups, that's an area where we've heard for people who are looking for peer support groups like AA or Overeaters Anonymous, that the experience of being a new person in a Zoom group is very challenging.
Absolutely. There's so many people, you mentioned parents and family members. There's so many people who are looking out for their loved ones and looking for signs and symptoms, and they're not sure when what they're looking at justifies the risk of a hospitalization. Can you tell us about some of those signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression that you see that you can advise families, okay, that's sort of an aha moment, if you would. When you see that, you need to be thinking about bringing in some experts or having that family member go out to see a doctor, a clinician, or go to the hospital?
Of course. So I think, there's some very basic ones. Certainly people with behavioral health issues, their appearance can change. Somebody who was very well groomed can start to be a little bit more disheveled. You can see differences in the tone of their hair, the way that their body looks, if they have, if they're not eating due to a psychiatric issue or from an eating disorder, you may see major weight loss or major weight gain. Somebody who's on substances can have certain impact in their eyes. I would say the patterns that are really the ones that families typically notice are things like sleeping too much. People who have constant ruminating thoughts, they may see somebody actually being short of breath or kind of cycling through what we're hearing a lot of right now, or a husband saying, my wife can't make a simple decision about what we're going to have for dinner, for instance. Something that would have been simple before has now produced enormous amounts of anxiety. I think the most helpful rule, however, that we can give to families or even to colleagues in a work setting is, how long do these behaviors last? And do they meet a couple of categories? So is it disrupting major life issues, sleep, exercise, eating, healthy behaviors? Is the person turning to maladaptive coping skills? Somebody who had a glass of wine, maybe once an evening, one glass is now having a whole bottle of wine and drinking differently than they used to. Or has somebody actually gone up to them and said, I'm concerned about these issues? This is, it's very hard in our culture to talk to people, particularly successful, highly functional people, about their behaviors. So if somebody has mentioned it at work, or you have a girlfriend who's come to a parent and said, I'm really concerned about my boyfriend and these behaviors, that's a sign that there might be something. And I would say the length of symptoms, typically these are not people who have had a symptom for a day. These are people who are adjusting over 2 or 3 weeks to a different lifestyle than what they've had before. At that point, it's important for a family member to figure out, or even a colleague to say, I'm noticing in a very factual and loving way to the extent it's possible. And I smile because having been a family member at the other end of this situation, it can be very challenging to maintain emotional control. But I'm concerned about you. I'm noticing these behaviors, describing them as objectively as you can. I'd love to be a resource to you. Can I introduce you to a supportive person, or are you open to help?
Yeah, I understand. I'm seeing this in my law practice as well. Absolutely. The very things that you're mentioning. I think, I remember I received a couple of referrals about a year ago, and those, they were sometimes divorce referrals, perhaps with a family business, and the business lost value suddenly and unexpectedly in March. You know, the client might have come to me in January, and we had one completely different set of expectation for outcome than we now do. And this has been difficult in my work as well, with a lot of clients. I've been dealing with clients who are getting sick, or clients whose family members are sick. A lot of concern about at what point do we do our estate planning? At what point do we potentially think about a prenuptial or a postnuptial or a divorce or a separation? There's a lot of timing issues because the values of businesses have been injured, and businesses are very often pivoting right now. You know, we're hearing a lot about those pivots. Well, it's really happened. The restaurant industry and the entertainment industry had such incredibly difficult impacts, but they've shifted into delivery and takeout and different types of businesses that were similar but different enough so that they have maintained profitability. But in the middle of that kind of business shifting, going through a divorce and needing to value the business has been difficult. And the individuals are suffering through their own legal matters in a way that they've never suffered before, because there's so many impacts to this. It's been difficult. I've also dealt with a lot of sibling rivalries. I always handle, you know, those financial exploitation cases or the family trust disputes or family asset disputes. Perhaps there's a matter where there's family breakdown among siblings and rivalries, but it's different in the past year because now with COVID and the threat that produces, people really don't know what to do. They don't know how to move and navigate because nothing feels the same and everything feels so charged right now.
I think that's so true. I'd be curious, Lisa, you know, one of the things that's always impressed me, and it's no surprise to me that you are you were a former social worker, because in the nature of your practice and the types of engagements that you get, it seems like you're very comfortable taking high risk situations and situations where there's lots of tension. And while I think attorneys deal with that in general, when it starts to go into the system navigation piece, it can be complicated. I'd be curious to hear, you know, what are the areas or examples of cases where you've had a role that people would typically assume, well, that's really something a psychiatrist deals with. That's not something an attorney would get involved in.
Yes, absolutely. You know, on Sunday night, I received a phone call. This happened. Things like this happen all the time. It's all spontaneous. And by the way, my clients and other lawyers and wealth managers and accountants, everybody, all of the people who are my contacts have my cell phone number. Everybody is welcome to call me at any time. I do take calls on Sunday nights, even on a long weekend. But I received a call Sunday night. A family was driving in from out of state. Their son was at a psychiatric facility here in Massachusetts, and they were told that their son had just contracted COVID and needed to either be transported to a medical facility or be discharged. And the family started the process of driving into Massachusetts to deal with this. So that's one situation where we might need a clinician, but perhaps a lawyer can help deal with this to manage the issue. I handle matters where I have literally assisted with a clinical team to transfer a person from one psychiatric hospital to another, perhaps with an escort. And I know, Arden, you and I use the same escorts who are very good at dealing with transferring individuals who are going from either a psychiatric placement to a long-term recovery program, or perhaps from a detoxification program into a longer-term recovery program. So we're able to navigate this. And it sometimes takes a lawyer to manage it, because you might have a guardianship issue that is involved, and you might have to transfer the guardianship from one state to another, or perhaps get guardianship so that we can make some consents, or perhaps there's family members who need to have medical records and communications with the care team, and we have an individual who doesn't understand how helpful it would be for family to advocate for him or her. And so we might need guardianship so that we can open access between the clinical team and the family members. Or perhaps it's an individual who has a significant eating disorder, and the only people who really know about what's happening is the university, the college, the university health center, and perhaps there's no communication to the parents. So what I can do is I can intervene strategically by coordinating the signing of a very power-boosted, durable power of attorney or a healthcare proxy that has HIPAA rights for the family member, or FERPA rights, that's the Federal Education Privacy Act. And by doing this, I can give the family the opportunity at long last to advocate for a family member who's over 18 years of age. Because remember, once you're over 18 years of age, you're an adult and you have the right to select who receives information about you and who does not. But if you are presently suffering from exacerbation of anxiety or paranoia or other mood disturbance or thought disturbance or some kind of a personality impact that's all related to mental health or treatment recovery, you might reject the very people who can be most helpful. Or perhaps we don't even want family involved, but we do want a third party. Sometimes I'm the person who is selected by family to play that role and to serve as the fiduciary. So by intervening legally, I'm able to loosen the situation enough to establish contact and communication across the different lines and start the process of advocating for somebody who can't advocate for themselves.
I think it's great. I think it's such an important service for families because many times, especially when you're dealing with someone who's resistant, families, they don't know what options exist. And during this time, having someone who can be a powerful, objective advocate is more important than ever.
Yeah, and we can work together this way, and we have. So you might have a resistant individual and the family wants to help, but the individual themselves is resisting. And so you could have, the families, people watching and people who have been our clients have benefited by having the kind of collaboration that the O'Connor Professional Group and Burns and Levinson have together. So for example, we could execute a discretionary trust where we discuss the milestones that we want the individual to achieve, behavioral change. And by discussing those milestones between the clinical team and the legal team, we're able to properly draft a discretionary trust that's an incentive trust, an incentive vehicle, or perhaps we use the clinical team. And I go to your team all the time, asking, what are those milestones? What is the behavioral change you're trying to aim for? What are the treatment protocols? What are the recommendations? Perhaps I can build this into a contract, a family contract. Or if an individual has unfortunately been involved in the criminal justice system, I might be able to work with you and your team, Arden, so that I can figure out what terms of probation would be helpful to an individual so that the legal system will see the issues as a mental health recovery situation and not a criminal justice situation worthy of criminal sentencing for individuals who really just need treatment. So that's the value added when you talk about resistant clients. This is how we can work together to overcome that resistance in the interest of the individual and the family.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of residential care. So have you had difficulty getting some of your clients into residential programs, into the longer term programs, and how are those programs managing COVID?
Sure. So it's a bit I will say in the beginning of COVID in March, it was a very complicated process. There were a lot of unknowns. There were a lot more. I can remember one particular eating disorder case that we were trying to help a mom out, get her daughter from Connecticut into a facility in New York. And all of a sudden, in the midst of the admission, they said, we're no longer accepting interstate referrals because of COVID. So things like that popped up a lot in the beginning. I think more facilities now have adjusted to the new quote unquote normal and have figured out how to maintain safety with patients. I think the biggest adjustments we see are some facilities are operating at much less capacity. The amount of people doing groups is much less than what it was previously. We are seeing, I mean, obviously there's some very basic precautionary measures around PPE equipment that are being utilized. We are seeing more facilities with wait lists. We're seeing a lot of families who are preferring for loved ones to go to smaller facilities or in certain parts of the country. And you do have to look at when you're admitting, you know, are you coming from another state that has certain restrictions? So it's a much more logistically complicated process. But they are operating. And I, like I said, I've been really surprised, pleasantly so, that there is an option for people to go into a facility. And in many cases, when we see somebody with a significant mental health issue or substance use issue that has been really hard for them to find structure in their home communities, we will suggest it as an option. The other thing I will mention is certain facilities are offering more of their services via telehealth as well. So in some facilities, you're meeting in person with your therapist, and others, you're meeting virtually for at least some portion of the providers you're seeing. So, I think it's a credit to the treatment industry that they've been able to navigate this time, because it is complicated for just the reasons you're saying. Somebody tests negative on their way in, they get a test when they're at the facility, then there's the question of exposure to other residents. So it is complicated.
Yeah, it sounds like there are some positive shifts, such as telehealth. I know that has helped in terms of guardianship and conservatorship as well. Now it used to be that we needed, in order to get a guardianship, which for those who don't know, is authority over an individual's personal decision-making, or if we needed to get a conservatorship, which for those who don't know is authority over financial decision-making, it used to be that we needed to get that individual in to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, a psychiatric nurse practitioner, or somebody who was licensed in Massachusetts in order to have that person certified to then testify or at least fill out an affidavit for a judge stating that the individual lacks mental capacity to make decisions for themselves. And now it can be done absolutely by telehealth, HIPAA compliant Zoom, and it's done. It's a 30-minute process. Nobody has to leave home. We don't have to coordinate an appointment. It's far easier. And the other advantage is during the COVID lockdown back in March and April, for example, I had one individual who was stuck in Florida who needed to have the guardianship in Massachusetts. He was coming back to Massachusetts. And so we were able to have a Massachusetts clinician interview him and evaluate him while he was in Florida. We got the guardianship on Zoom, and we ended up having him transferred here to Massachusetts to come back home. And we got him into some very good care. Nobody really needed to walk into an office or do anything like that. So I'm seeing those silver linings as well, and the new positive shift based on technological advances, both in guardianship and conservatorship. And one of the nice things about that is with regard to guardianship or conservatorship, the courts understand that we might need just a temporary guardianship or a temporary conservatorship. Maybe we just need it for a month or 3 months or 6 months or a year. But now, given this crisis, the courts are starting to recognize the need for flexibility in its orders. And our hearings are all by Zoom anyway. So we're all able to have these hearings quickly. Clients like it because they're not charged for travel time and parking and waiting around the courthouse. It's literally a 15 or 20-minute hearing from beginning to end after a telehealth appointment. So it has been better. The courts are understanding if you've got the right lawyer and clinical team, so that the lawyer and clinical team can work together to make a recommendation that goes outside of the typical standard thinking, then you can get a creative decree out of the courts right now because they're willing to listen and find ways. And it sounds like you're doing the same thing with your clinicians and your staff there. You're trying to find new positive shifts and looking for the silver lining in the pandemic in terms of treating the individuals who come to you for services.
Absolutely. So we are still operating in person, and for many people who, as I mentioned, are struggling with the idea of going into a residential, it can be a nice option to have somebody who can come to your home and do some intensive coaching and collaborate with outpatient providers. The other thing we're seeing is, for as many of the downsides of not being able to go into a hospital and access a traditional intensive outpatient program, there are upsides. People who previously would have used all sorts of reasons as barriers to therapy. I can't get time off of work. I can't find one I like. Now have a lot more options, have it at times that are convenient. And I would say the last piece we're seeing is we're seeing companies now who are starting to reevaluate their productivity, their healthcare claims costs, and really trying to look at how are they adjusting the benefits they offer to employees around behavioral health issues. So we've had a high demand for sort of fluid coaching. We'll have a designated individual who will work with whether it's a law firm or a financial services company. They have their profile, and employees can make appointments to actually interact with this person. And it might be somebody who doesn't need the full services of a traditional talk therapist or doesn't have an intense trauma, but is really anxious about being able to homeschool their children, or is having trouble with their boss and adjusting expectations. So it's been really interesting to see during the pandemic just how much focus in the media and how that's played out for employers when they're considering what benefits are important to offer to employees. I guess, one of the things I would ask is, have there been silver linings for you in terms of your practice? It sounds like certainly on the hearing side, there are some. Have there been others that you've seen in your practice?
Yes, I think I've been able to reduce anxiety from my clients, not only in the mental health work that I do, but in the divorce work that I do. So ever more frequently, I'm taking some cases to mediation, conciliation, and private adjudication by Zoom. We're handling depositions by Zoom. We're doing estate planning remotely. And for this reason, it's so much easier. If I'm handling an alimony modification action, or I'm handling a divorce action, my client and I can be by Zoom, and we can be communicating with a mediator instead of going to the courthouse and dealing with all of the agitation and anxiety that goes along with being in a courthouse. And another huge advantage to that is that my clients don't want their personal affairs and their family wealth aired out in a public courthouse. It's not safe. And it's also very tricky in terms of family value. If a family owns real estate and you go through court and you have an open court hearing about the divorce or about a family issue, then everybody technically in the courthouse could potentially realize that there may be real estate sales. And then you look at potential value fluctuations or disintegration of value and dissipation of the estate that you're talking about. It's not safe for families of wealth to have their finances aired out in court, whether it's through a divorce, whether it's through an undue influence action, or an action such as a guardianship involving a family member, or a conservatorship involving a family member who may have undue influence. They may have somebody influencing them to leave assets to somebody else, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a new romantic interest, perhaps there's a sibling rivalry and family is competing for assets. So by keeping all of that outside of the courthouse, or having a private Zoom without the court and the public available to watch, has taken the drama out, it has taken the danger out, and it has ensured privacy for my clients, which has been a huge silver lining. And I'd imagine you're seeing the same thing in terms of that privacy. Yes, we have social distancing, and yes, we can't gather, but the beauty of it is the privacy in it.
Absolutely. So especially when you think about people who live in smaller towns, I'm quarantining here in Long Island, and there are therapists' office. And for people who have very public personas who are well-known figures, it can be embarrassing to walk into a therapist's office or a psychiatrist's office. And as much as I think one silver lining we've seen from the pandemic is that there's a lot more mainstream publications and media attention paid to just how much of the population is struggling. So on the one hand, there's still stigma still exists. I would say on the other hand, there just continues to be much more attention paid to the state of the mental health of, the US as a country. And I think that will help to normalize issues of I'm experiencing anxiety and it's okay because so many of my peers have it. But that said, when you get to the privacy issue, for those clients who really do not want to be seen in certain environments walking into a clinician's office, they now can do this from the privacy of their own home. And we're seeing also that the cancellation rates have gone down, that many people, if you think about a busy professional who's seeing a therapist for anxiety and something goes wrong, I'm thinking particularly about lawyers because I'm on the call today with you. And if you think about someone has something that went wrong at work and they need to stay in their offices, it's more than likely they're going to cancel that 5 o'clock session with their therapist. If they can actually have that session from the privacy of their office or their home, there's an increasing chance that the person gets the care that they need over time. And I think one of the other benefits is there's been some loosening of the telehealth regulations in terms of, it had previously been that you have to be licensed in the same state as the person who's receiving therapy is residing in. And that in some cases is fine. In another case, it makes it complicated. If you have an 18-year-old who's from New Jersey and then goes to college in California, I think what we will see is telehealth, first of all, is here to stay. And there had been prior to the pandemic some question as to whether it was as impactful as in-person therapy. Now there's an acceptance in terms of it being a true modality that people can get good support from. But I think we're also going to see less and less barriers and more pressures on the insurance companies to reimburse it at a healthy level so that clinicians are incented to take patients via telehealth. And I think those are all positives given the low amount of people that are treated for anxiety disorders and depression and substance use when you compare that with the high amounts of people who suffer from those diagnoses.
Yeah, that's very interesting. One of the things that we're talking about really is dealing with the stigma that in this pandemic, we've been able to manage the stigma issues that become a barrier to receiving both legal support and clinical support. There's so much privacy that stigma is less important. You're not walking into a clinic, for methadone. Nobody's seeing, they're coming to you. They're bringing their car and the injectable to you. And so you don't, or you're dealing with, let's say, support for your family member who has an eating disorder. You don't have to walk in the door. It's a different thing. You don't have to go to a legal office. I have a lot of clients who used to have to make something up for where they were. They were concerned about their phone app, that their spouse might know that they were meeting with me, or that they were at a legal office. And so we no longer have to deal with that. But in terms of stigma and that sort of thing, it reminds me, because we're all family members and relationship matters so much. And we have all dealt with family members who are experiencing significant challenges. I think that in this pandemic, it's especially hard for parents for the reasons you mentioned, which is they're dealing with family members, and they're very often their young children or adult children's mental health issues, addiction issues, helping their children to do remote schooling, whether it's young children or going to college or high school, whatever it is. And a lot of the anxiety on parents is created by feeling like they're not good enough. I can imagine, I know that I'm doing a lot of that kind of coaching. You were talking about family coaching and navigating through that feeling, that anxiety feeling of parents not being good enough. What are you advising your clients about parents being good enough?
Well, I think you used the exact phrase, which is good enough. And a lot of what I have found in the pandemic is, on the one hand, you have people writing articles that can be so inspirational about all the things they've achieved. If you have my mindset, you feel guilty that you're not writing your first novel. You haven't become a master chef. You aren't doing yoga poses that you envied 2 years ago on Instagram. And so I think similar to that, if we think about parenting trends, I think some people thought, well, I'll get to be home with my children. It's going to be like make-believe every day, and it's going to be fantasy camp. And the reality is, for some people, there have been some really great learning. So we see a lot more dads who are not traveling for work, and they're getting stronger in their bonds with their children, which is fantastic. But realistically, if we think about grown adults who have now come back to quarantine with parents out of school, or who got furloughed from a job and are living at home, or parents who both are working and trying to manage children who are on remote learning, it's inevitable that something is going to have to give. There's only so many hours of the day, and it's much more likely when you're confined in small spaces and everyone has competing objectives in terms of what they need to get done in a day, that there's going to be higher degrees of tension. And so the phrase good enough is one that we really tout, which is to have families think about what their priorities are. So a simple solution might be something like, we as a family want to eat 3 meals a week together. Do they have to be organic, vegetarian meals and that are beautifully crafted? Maybe not. Maybe chicken nuggets is okay 2 nights out of the 3, but we are going to sit together and we're going to sit for a half an hour without our phones and really talk about what we learned that day or what we're grateful for. And so I think that trend with parents is really trying to figure out, 1, to stop comparing yourselves to other, 2, to not, my biggest advice to parents during this time has been, if you're nervous about your kids' anxiety level, the first place they're going to look is the role model that you set. So considering how much news you're consuming, is there CNN blaring in the living room? Is it just on loop, or are you watching it in bits and pieces and making some time to take care of yourself and your loved ones, even if it's much shorter moments? I think we have this vision that every day there's going to be an hour of bonding time. I don't have children, but I have 3 small dogs, and every day I have these very high expectations for what's going to happen. And I've sort of had to say, some days I have wonderful experiences with them. Some days I don't. And some days I settle for something in between, which is a 5-minute experience that is a meaningful one, that I'm not distracted trying to do 5 other things. So I think parents giving themselves a pat on the back for getting through this time, trying to keep their anxiety. One of the best comments I heard was from somebody quoting a child development specialist. And there were all these questions in the beginning of the pandemic. Do I homeschool? Are we doing a pandemic pod? Do they go back to private school? Do they go to public school? And the comment, and I'm probably going to I'm going to kill the translation of this, but essentially what the comment was is, the best thing you can do as a parent is make the choice educationally that is going to allow you to remain the most emotionally resilient. So if you have the bandwidth because of your support system to homeschool your kids, and that makes you feel the most comfortable, great. But if you both are working and that's going to create enormous challenges, you're going to do your best to keep your children healthy and safe when they go back to school. And I found that to be really true from what we see with clients who have children with various special needs, that the more the parents can embrace a healthy attitude and give themselves a break on the smaller things, the better the children seem to be.
I agree with you. Family offices and family businesses have the advantage, if you will, of being familiar with strategic planning. They're doing the planning, they're looking at family paradigms. They have certain stories that they've grown up with because there's multiple generations of wealth. And there was somebody in the beginning who had certain values and principles and ethics and paradigms, family paradigms, that have helped to create the wealth that the families have. And so as you're talking about this, I'm remembering that a lot of those families are in the habit of strategic planning. They're dealing with the issues that go along with transferring wealth generation by generation, running businesses through thick and thin and through crisis and joy. And it relates to the family paradigms and the family stories that keep the family together. And it reminds me very much of values. You're talking about the value proposition when we're talking about whether we're good enough, whether we're resilient, and how we're managing these crises, we're talking about finding values. Literally one hour ago, I was in a course that was taught by the colleague of somebody who's watching us right now. And it was a course in identifying your 5 top values, and then understanding and identifying the next 5 and the next 5, and rank ordering and figuring out why it matters. So some of those values might be, for example, leadership, loyalty, resilience, as you mentioned, adaptability, relationship. But it's that type of value driving that if we as clinicians and lawyers can work with our clients who are dealing with difficult family crisis, by figuring out those values first, sometimes we're able to identify what matters most and how we're going to treat the problem, whether clinically, whether socially, whether legally. It's identifying those values. When you work with your clients, how are you helping your clients to identify their own values and paradigms?
It's a great question. And I think it depends on the engagement. I think many of our clients are coming to us in full-blown crisis. And so it tends to be, they want a fix-it solution. And a lot of what we're trying to do is help families think differently about the way in which they contribute to any issue. So a classic example would be a mom who has overfunctioned on behalf of her son who has an alcohol issue and has rushed in and saved him. And so helping her figure out, when you mention the values, what is she looking for long-term for her son? And while in the short term, while we understand that covering up with his boss and making a phone call on his behalf seemed like it would save his reputation, what does that teach him in the long term? So there's a lot of those types of teachable moments. But I also wanted to comment, because I think you mentioned one of the key pieces that we are doing a lot of work with clients on now, which is adaptability. And I do think for every, it depends on the outlook of clients. We all start in this world and live in this world with different levels of resilience and different levels of believing that the cup is half empty or half full, no matter how you want to say it. I tend to be more of a Pollyanna-ish person and believe that most things can have a silver lining. And I think when you mention the adaptability, I think one of the things we're seeing with parents, particularly affluent parents who have been accustomed to being able to use money to get access to things that they want, that their family members want, that their children want, us learning as a society and teaching children who have not grown up during war times or during significant periods of wanting something that you can't have, that this is a period of time of sacrifice. And so one of the things we've talked with a lot of families about is, could you turn this into an opportunity to even do remote volunteer work, for instance? Could this be the year you don't celebrate holidays with financial gifts for each other, but instead make a donation? Or could you watch a film or do something that starts to plant in the head of smaller children, particularly that you're lucky if you're in a home where there is a stable income and everybody is able to socially distance, maintain a similar lifestyle, have food on the table. You're in the lucky group in our country. And especially for affluent families, I think it's a really important message. And I think it can be a very powerful one for young children. So instead of it being about how much life stinks because I can't have the birthday party I was hoping for this year, boy, life is great that all these people cared about you, drove by the house, and think about those children who didn't, let's give money to a family that couldn't even afford a birthday cake. And so it sounds very simplistic, but I do think, again, it comes back to the parenting outlook, but to the extent parents can really embrace that and focus less on the negative. And I am somebody who misses theater. I miss travel. I miss all the things we do, but I've also learned, I don't have as much work travel. That's been really great. I've been able to commit to a meditation program. I've done a stress reduction course. None of these things would have probably happened for me had it not been for COVID, because I wouldn't have had the bandwidth. So I think to the extent you can kind of turn some of the negatives onto the positives and then help children see how great their position is, versus many of us in the world who aren't in those positions, it can be a real learning opportunity.
I think that's really beautiful and very well said, especially now with the news that we're hearing, which creates a lot of anxieties for individuals. The feeling that even though we are in our homes and not able to really leave, the ability to look after others who are less fortunate than ourselves and to participate in the community is actually very healthy, and it will encourage that growth, that community participation and engagement, whether it might be in the way of making a donation, of money, or donation of canned goods, or just in helping in some endeavor. It brings us out of our own situation, out of our own pain, and brings us into a helping modality for others. And it helps us engage with others. And it's that engagement that will reduce the anxiety. I know I do a lot of coaching with families that I am representing about engagement with family members who are struggling, and staying involved, staying present for them, and being part of the team of solution. And that's part of the adaptability that you were talking about, the flexibility and adaptability. But tell us, I know we're starting to run short on time. We have about 10 minutes left. So before we end, I do want to take some questions if there are any, but I first want to ask you, Arden, if you can give us some concluding advice. You work with some fantastic clinicians, and I'm wondering, what advice can you give people that will help family members to help their loved ones when they're addressing depression and anxiety?
So I think, one thing that I always like to say, whether it's to an advisor serving families or to the family members themselves, is I think one of the things that we as a country, are afraid of is offending someone. We don't want to bring a topic up that might get them upset, might rock the boat. And I think there are a lot of family members who also worry, if my loved one has anxiety or depression, it means that the life they're going to lead is going to be worse than the one that they have now. And I would say, if you are an advisor or if you are a family member and you're concerned about the mental health of another person, a colleague, a friend, a loved one, I think remembering that there are so many different ways to access treatment, and many people who wind up getting the care that they need are so thankful for the person who brought them to this realization that they could benefit. And people go on to lead extraordinarily productive and much more fulfilling lives than had they sort of stayed in the rut that was causing them pain. And so I think mine is more of a message of hope. Despite our family tragedy, I do truly believe that people, even with these issues for a long period of their life, can get to a better place. And to the extent you can be one of the brave souls who helps them get there, I think it's an enormously fulfilling role.
It is, absolutely. If people need to reach you, how can they do that?
Sure. So people are welcome to call our intake line, our website. The name of the company is O'Connor Professional Group. The website also has a form. You can just click on it to get in touch. And it's www.o'connor, OConnor, P as in professional, G as in group.com. And you have my personal information. I also have people similar to you who reach out via email or cell phone at any point, which I'm happy to take any kind of calls or emails, even during off hours as well.
Terrific, terrific. And for those who don't already have my contact data, I can be reached by cell at 617-966-9582. And my email address is lcukier@burnslev.com. That's LCUKIER at B as in boy, URN as in Nancy, S as in Sam, LEV.com. Arden, is there anything else that you'd like to add before I conclude for us?
No, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. I always enjoy presenting with you.
It's been such a pleasure to have you. And I also very much enjoy presenting with you. I look forward to the day when we can actually meet in person in the same state, same town, and same venue. And I hope those venues stay open. Just for those watching, this is the Business of Family webinar. This is my third episode. Please stay tuned. If you reach out to me by email, I'll make sure that you receive the next notice of the next episode. And we hope that you stay well. Thank you for watching.